Hi, good morning to everyone who is joining the conference online and to everyone who is here today in person. On behalf of my co-authors, I will try to highlight why manual as well as mechanized experiments do have their relevance in experimental archaeology. I will specifically focus on the effect of human variability on tool performance and useful formation within a defined experimental setup. Usually, we perform experiments to understand the function and use of a specific tool. This means we try to figure out which movement was performed, which contact material might have been worked, how intensively a tool was used, etc. Thereby, experiments can be performed manually or more controlled by means of mechanical devices, depending on the expected outcome. These different types of experiments can also be called generations of experiments. As just mentioned before in the talk, the contribution of different experiments presented by Joel. Without going into detail, I would like to highlight the main differences between the generations. First generation experiments are manually performed experiments. They commonly help to identify factors, generate hypotheses, and lead to initial observations. Control and standardization do not normally play a major role. This is not the case for second-generation experiments. Standardization is significant. For instance, the contact material or the samples can be standardized to eliminate the effect of individual variables. Thus, the second generation reflects experiments which are highly controlled, standardized, and mechanized. The aim of second-generation experiments is to test individual factors independently and to identify reproducible and reliable patterns, as well as to reveal the effect of certain variables within the tested experimental setup. Unfortunately, the gap between the two generations of experiments is rather big, and as mentioned, they have different outcomes. While the results of first-generation experiments can be most often directly applied to the archaeological record, the ones from second-generation experiments cannot. Therefore, we felt the need for adding another type of experiment, which is able to bridge the gap between the other two types. Third-generation experiments follow consequently, and their goal is to test the previously identified patterns by introducing some human-like variability. Third-generation experiments can be performed with the help of mechanics. As in our case here, we used a robotic arm. These robots are also called cobots, which is short for collaborative robots. It allows for the inclusion of human-like features, as for example it can be programmed to get tired over time so that the force gets reduced, to shiver slightly, which makes the performed movement inaccurate, or as you can see in the video, you can grab it and perform a movement which will be copied then by the robot. Going back to the initial idea of understanding the function and use of a tool, we were interested in the question whether or not causal mechanical relationships are still applicable when human variability is included. Moreover, we wanted to understand how movement variability influences the formation of fuse wear and tool performance. In the following slides, I'll guide you through the details of the experiment we performed with the aim to answer the research question. For conducting the experiment, we used different setups reflecting the different generations of experiments. In the first case, we used the so-called SMART tester, an industrial material test stand. The SMART tester allows to perform movements in a highly controlled, repeatable, and precise way. Secondly, we used the robotic arm. And in the third step, we conducted the experiment manually. Within these different setups, we always perform 2000 unidirectional cutting strokes per sample. To get a better idea of how this looked like, here are some videos of the different setups, starting with the SMART tester performing a highly controlled second-generation experiment. The second video shows the robotic arm performing a linear cutting movement, reflecting a third-generation experiment. And finally, a video of the manually conducted first-generation experiment. To make the results of the different experimental setups used comparable, we decided to control as many variables as possible so that the variability in movement is the main independent variable. As contact material, we choose artificial bone plates from the Swiss company Synbone, which are made of a modified bone-like polyurethane. For the samples, we cut size-defined blanks with a rock saw out of flint nodules. And with a diamond bandsaw, one edge of these blanks was cut at a 45 degrees angle. The samples all have 3 beads on the 2 main surfaces. These beads function as a coordinate system and allow for a relocation to the exact same spot on the surface at each state within the experiment, which becomes significant during a later use-wear analysis. Next to the contact material and the samples, further variables were identical in all experimental setups. These are the number of unidirectional cutting strokes, as I mentioned before, and the cutting lengths were 17 cm each. Additionally, the smart tester as well as the robotic arm are sensor controlled. This means variables such as force, speed and acceleration were either monitored or sensor controlled. During the manually conducted part of the experiment, these 3 aspects were not controlled, which means that they act as additional independent variables. Speaking about independent variables, as mentioned previously, the variability in the performed movement is what changed within the different experimental setups. This variability is illustrated here. As you can see, the smart tester or material tester performs the movement in an exact and repeatable way, and also the applied force stays the same. The robotic arm, however, was programmed in 3 different ways. In what we called experiment number 2, the robot performed a linear movement as the material tester before, but precision in repeating the exact same movement over and over again is limited by its multiple joints, so the cuts vary slightly. In the subsequent experiment number 3, we hand-guided the robotic arm, as you have seen in the initial video, and the robot copied the movement. In both cases, the force was set up with 50 Newton. As a final robotic experiment, additional to the linear movement, the robot was programmed to jitter and to get exhausted. Due to this programmed exhaustion, in the course of the 2000 cutting strokes, the force was decreased from 50 to 40 Newton. In the manual approach, we tried to perform the cutting as linear as possible, but we were not as successful as the smart tester or the robot, and also the force was neither controlled nor measured. Per experiment, we used 3 samples, which means we used 15 samples in total. We documented each standard sample before and after the experiment, always following the same protocol. The uniform documentation included photography and weighing, 3D scanning as well as EDF stitching using the digital microscope. Molds of the sampled surface were also taken for the use-wear analysis. Additionally, the hardness as one raw material property was measured once with a Liebre-bound hardness test. We also created a protocol on protocols.io detailing every single step and information about the workflow. After the experiment, we conducted qualitative and quantitative use-wear analyses on the samples. Thus, we documented each sample before the experiment and after 2000 strokes with a metallographic microscope and an LSM, a laser confocal microscope. Per sample, we always selected 3 spots on the used sample in an area where use-wear had developed. Then we switched to the molds, which represent the surface from before use, and measured the exact same 3 spots again. We also analyzed the contact material, or to be more specific, the grooves in the contact material produced through the cutting movement. For the analysis, we used the Sensifer S-White, a surface metrology measuring instrument. By using the Sensifer S-White, we were able to measure the depth and the width of each groove. In the following slides, I will present the results we have obtained so far with this experiment starting with the edge damage that occurred on the sample's active edge. We could gain information regarding the edge damage based on the digital images and the 3D scans. Here you can see just an example of a sample used during the manually conducted part of the experiment. However, the sample is representative for all 15 samples. As you can see, only little edge damage occurred, which also results in a small volume loss. The quantification of the grooves in terms of their depth and width shows some interesting results. The more variability was included in the movement, the more the depth and especially the width of the grooves increased. The increase in width was to be expected for cuts not performed in an identically linear movement. Additionally, the force applied during the manual experiment seems to influence the characteristics of the grooves. During the manual experiment, we more than likely exceeded the attempted target of 50 Newton by trying to reach efficient and increasing penetration depth. Judged by the qualitative use wear analysis, all samples developed some marginal use wear within the contact zone of the artificial bone plate. Here you can see one example for each experimental approach in a rather low magnification to give you an overview. Qualitatively, the use wear does not vary a lot from experiment to experiment. The quantitative data was analyzed according to the ISO 25178 based on surface texture and further surface parameters. This means we calculated in total 35 parameters, and discussing the results for each of them would go beyond the scope of this talk. That's why we selected SQ as an example. SQ is an areal field parameter expressing the root mean squared height of the surface roughness. Simply said, the higher the SQ value, the higher the surface roughness. The data points you can see here always represent the mean value of the 3 measurements we acquired per sample. And plotted here is the difference between the SQ value before and after 2000 strokes. Surprisingly, there is a clear trend. With use, the surfaces get smoother in all 15 samples. The data suggests that the formation of use wear does not differ due to the changes in movement. Instead, the trend stays the same. To sum up, the experiment represented here shows an important aspect. Manual and mechanized experiments are equally important. Although they result in different data and they reach different outcomes, the data is still complementary. For understanding the effect causation of individual variables, we need highly controlled experiments, such as second-generation experiments. Certain parameters, as for example the required force, can only be identified when performing an experiment manually. And robots incorporating repeatable and/or random variability can help to fill the gap between the other 2 types of experiments. As demonstrated, movement variability does not seem to influence use wear formation or tool performance. At the same time, the mechanical relationships still seem relevant when human variability is included. Finally, the presented 3-fold experimental workflow allows for a direct applicability to the ecological record. Thanks for listening, and thanks to everyone who was involved in organizing the conference.